I've been finding a lot of really interesting models on CG Trader recently, and most recently it's been this series of 3D printable environments for things like action figures and so forth by Luke Masasi. He has quite a few designs here, but the things that really attracted my attention, of course, were the Jabba's Palace related ones, including this throne room design, which is kind of a modular thing that you can print over time to gradually build out the entire interior of Jabba's palace, including the throne room and the rancor pit, and even a little bit more obscure areas like the area where the guests to Jabba's palace are sitting and having drinks and so forth. So I got in contact with him and asked if he would be willing to share one of his designs with me to print on the channel, and he kindly agreed. So I decided to start with the throne room, which you see here. As I mentioned, it's modular, so this is just one section of the palace, but it's also scalable, so you can make it bigger or smaller depending on what scale you want to use. He has versions that are scaled all the way from 1/18th scale, which is action figure scale, the 3 3/4 inch action figure scale, to 1/6 scale, which would be insanely large. So these are all divided up into little sections that you print separately and then glue together. So you can see here, each of these is a separate section that you would print on its own. And part of the reason for that is to allow you to scale them to different sizes while still being able to fit it on your printer. He's also included some channels here, which you can see at the top of the model, and some holes in a couple places to allow you to install LEDs that'll shine through these windows and vents and things, and should make it pretty easy to light this model up with LEDs. It also allows you to move Jabba's throne back and forth, as you saw in the movie, and has a trap door here. So I was pretty impressed with the model just looking at it, but I wasn't sure about my own ability to put something like this together and finish it in a way that would look good. And I was also a little bit wary of making something that would be really huge, since I don't have a lot of extra space or time. In the end, I decided to scale it down by 50% so that I could print a smaller version of it at first and see how it worked out. And because I had already made some half-scale vintage Kenner action figures in a previous video, which you can see up in the upper right, I thought this would be the perfect home for them. I printed the pieces on my Creality CR10S4, just using some scrap filament that I had left over on various rolls. These pieces will end up being almost entirely hidden, so I used rough settings for them, but I used finer 0.1mm layer heights for this section that you can actually see. So here are most of the parts all printed out and ready for assembly. Obviously, if you set out to make a tiny throne room from the beginning, you wouldn't necessarily have to cut it up into pieces this small, but I'm just using his existing set. You can see I also printed it in multiple colors of filament, even for the same piece, because I was just using up the ends of some rolls. Seemed like a good opportunity to do that. As I mentioned, a lot of these are going to be hidden in the final product, but parts like this will be seen, so I used the finest settings to make sure that they were looking decent without having to sand or do anything else to them, really. In fact, the only sanding that I did do was just to take some coarse sandpaper and rub each of the sections on each side just to rough it up and allow the glue to bite into it a little bit better. And I think this did help quite a bit when assembling it. The assembly just consists of supergluing the parts together, more or less. There's a PDF that Luke will give you when you purchase the parts that'll show you where everything is supposed to go, and it was relatively easy to figure out, with one or two exceptions maybe. For the most part, I didn't have any trouble with fit, although things like this Jabba pusher, which allows you to push the throne forward, was a little tight, but that may just be because I shrunk this down to half the intended size. That said, I did have to break out the hammer at one point to try and finesse one of the parts into place, which sort of worked and sort of didn't. But yeah, I mean, it worked fine overall, and I think if you're printing this out at the intended scale, you'll have no problem whatsoever. I did make one mistake, or at least I thought I had made a mistake, and then I took steps to get rid of it. I cut out this piece because I thought I had put it in wrong. Turns out it should be there. So I had to go back and actually recreate it with a little epoxy putty, which wasn't that big of a deal, but felt a little dumb. In hindsight, I probably shouldn't have fully assembled all of this before going ahead and finishing and painting it, because especially with this small version, it made it difficult to access some of the more recessed parts in the back, but I managed to figure it out more or less. Leaving this roof section off in particular probably would have been a good idea. After I had everything glued together, I started using some Tamiya putty to try and fill in the gaps and seams between the pieces, but this didn't really work all that well. The Tamiya putty is kind of more of a fine thing for fine details, I think, and I really needed something that I could kind of slop on there a little bit more indiscriminately. So what I did was to just cover the floor part and some of the walls with Bondo, and this worked surprisingly well. Then I sprayed it with a gray primer and did a little fine gap filling with the Tamiya putty again. But here you have basically the finished and ready for painting throne room. And as I say, I was really impressed with how cool this texture looks with the Bondo, having done really nothing to it. I just took a piece of cardboard and kind of smooshed it on, and it looks great. As I mentioned in my video about painting the Max Rebo band, I'm trying to learn how to use an airbrush. Probably it would make more sense to spray the base coat of this with just some sort of a spray can, but I thought I would give it a try and just get some practice in with the airbrush, and I think it actually worked pretty well. I'm starting to, I think, get a little bit better control over it. It's still not perfect. After I had the base coat done, I took a darker brown, a little bit more of a red brown, and used that on places that would be recessed, or also stippled it around just to kind of give the base color a little bit more depth, and ran it along the archway here and in a few other places. And this was surprisingly effective, actually. To take this side section as an example, just doing this in a few places made it look way more realistic than I thought it really would be. And in fact, I was able to basically finish this off to a satisfactory standard just using those two colors and not using a brush on anything except for this detail work here on the archway. Now, this design is intended to be used as an environment for people's action figures primarily, so he doesn't actually have a design for Jabba himself or a throne, because you're kind of expected to supply that yourself. For this half-scale version, though, I decided I would print the throne from Desert Octopus that he made of, this is a scan of the Walmart throne from a while back. There's some problems with this throne, though, because it seems like maybe the bottom being unnecessarily detailed is kind of messing it up, but I actually had to print this 3 times. Here you can see the second attempt, and it was just a complete failure. The third time was also a failure, but it was good enough. The top part printed well enough that I decided I would just go ahead and use it. As you can see, I'm trying the airbrush on the throne here as well. And at first I was trying to use some shading with a brown color that didn't really match the gray that I was using. I wasn't too happy with this, but it started to come together a little bit later on. I started using some black to outline these cracks, or whatever they're called, in the surface of the throne, and it doesn't look like much right now, but then I came in and kind of tried to smooth out those black lines a little bit and started looking a little bit more passable. Then I added some more gray on top of it, and after a while it actually started to look halfway decent. You can see how much of a mess it is on the bottom there, but we won't talk about that. I went in with some gold because I couldn't find my bronze paint, and then went over the top of that with a brown wash to make it a little more bronzy looking. Then I moved on to the railing. I don't have footage of me painting the railing itself, but I thought I did want to show you this. I printed the hookah and frog bowl in transparent resin, and then painted the details on in gold so that it would look like it was gold with glass portions on it, like a glass bowl. And, honestly, it turned out pretty well. I just sort of inserted the hookah into the railing. It was quite a tight fit, so it's just a pressure fit there. And, it looks pretty good, especially for this scale. Then I just glued that on top of the throne that I just painted. And considering this took very little time to do with the airbrush, I'm quite happy. And after doing a little more detail work and putting all the figures in place, this is what it looks like. You can also notice that I've added the LED lighting there, which I'll talk about in just a second. I'm really pleased with how well this turned out. It's surprisingly good. Now, the actual full-sized one would have more details like ductwork and other vents and things going on in it, and I would probably, spend a little more time trying to get everything nice and accurate, but for this sort of test version, I don't think it could have gone much better. I probably could have printed it slightly larger, though, because Jabba is a little bit cramped. This is what the entire thing looks like. You can see the channels there for the LED wiring, which I did do for the first time. I've never actually wired up a model before. This is not the prettiest job in the world, but it has a battery pack here in the back, 2 AA batteries, and they power all of the LEDs that are connected here together, and then I just used some hot glue to fit them in there. I used these small LEDs that you can buy that are pre-wired, and they have a resistor included so that you don't have to worry about them burning out or whatever. It was basically just a matter of soldering them all together to the battery pack, although I did have to extend one of the wires so that it would reach. And here's the side. As I said, I was super pleased and surprised at how easy it was to use the airbrush to get this kind of Adobe look for the walls of the palace. I suppose I should talk about the special features of the set. We have the trap door here, which I did have a little trouble with because it was so small. The hinges didn't quite work right. I had to replace the printed hinges with a paper clip. But you can see if you remove the sort of lever from the back of the set, it'll fall down, and then if you put it back, it sort of goes back up. It works, but not spectacularly well. And the same could be said with the Jabba pusher here. It's supposed to push the throne forward, but it kind of goes in fits and starts, and you have to be careful not to launch Jabba all the way out of the palace. I'm not sure if I have shown the small version of Salacious Crumb here before on the channel. I just recently painted him up, and I think it turned out pretty well. Kind of a cute little guy there. Yes, this is the same Jabba that I've shown you in the past, and of course here is the throne that I painted. And I'm really actually pretty pleased with this, especially the railing with the glass effect turned out well. Let's just not talk about the bottom. As a test to see if I could handle putting together this kind of model and finishing and painting it, I think this was a big success. And while I could definitely put more work into the details and so forth, and there's a lot more things that can be printed and done to this model, it still looks pretty good, and it didn't really take me that long to do either. I decided I'm going to make the 3 3/4 inch version of this for my larger action figures, and so I'll probably be making a video about that in the future. If you're interested in doing this for yourself, I'll put the links in the video description to the CG Trader pages for this set and others, and I'll also include a link to the Facebook group that Masasi has created for his models, and people kind of share their progress and can ask questions there as well. So it's a useful resource if you actually do want to put together some of these models. Obviously, I expect the larger scale versions to be more impressive and more detailed than this, but this gives you some idea. Let me know if you have any questions or comments, and thanks very much for watching. As usual, this video was brought to you with the help of my patrons, including these Palace VIPs and Angelica Brady. You can support me for as little as $1 a month, and that gets you a number of cool perks like early access to my videos and the ability to chat with me and other Jabba fans on the Patreon site, as well as get some behind-the-scenes posts about things that I'm working on. Check out the link in the video description if you're interested. See you next time.